Focusing on a period of roughly 25 years, beginning around 1957 and ending in the early 1980s, education shock, learning, architecture, and politics in the 1960s and 70s conceives the long 1960s and 70s as an archive of past futures, unfinished projects, abandoned experiments, and forgotten but hugely impactful education reforms. While engaging these essential temporal dimensions, education shock mainly attends to the spaces and spatialities where education as a pedagogical practice took shape and place, became reconfigured, and where the national and often transnational systems of education materialized. Monuments in the shape of brutalist campuses or open plan schools, these systems were, however, increasingly confronted and challenged by social and political movements that sought to escape the limiting spatial and pedagogical conditions of mass education. All over the world, radical alternatives that pursued integration and decolonization struggled to find liberating and self-determined ways of pedagogical placemaking. Making accessible this archive of political, architectural, and pedagogical designs and counter-designs hopefully renders and tangible and sensible its value as a resource for materials and tools that help to think and act within and alongside currently existing spaces and temporalities of education, as well as for the political debates and pedagogical practices that aim at rebuilding, if not overhauling, learning environments that fail to meet the requirements of a given moment. I'm showing here some of the situations in the exhibition hall at HKW at Berlin during installation in early March 2021. These are, in a way, work in progress pictures or images of the exhibition in being installed. A first public articulation in the process of making available and accessible this archive resource was a modestly scaled exhibition at the Basis for Aktuelle Kunst, BAK, in Utrecht in 2016-2017. Titled Learning Laboratories, Architecture, Instructional Technology, and the Social Production of Pedagogical Space around 1970, the exhibition was accompanied by the conference The Real Estate of Education. From the beginning, the project was structured according to the close collaboration with the hosting institution. BAK continues to be a partner of Education Shock, and a number of collaborations with artists, visual practitioners, researchers, scholars of different provenance. In Utrecht, the architectural scholar Gregor Harbusch, the artist Florian Zeifang, and the architects Lisa Schmidt-Collinet and Alex Schmöger, the filmmaker Philippa César and the educational historian Sonja Vaz-Borges, the artist Jakob Jakobsen, and the artist and filmmaker Wendelin van Oldenburg, among others, participated. All of them are also contributing to the project's itinerary at HKW in different capacities, with new works or enhanced versions of what they presented in learning laboratories. A major contribution, both in Utrecht and Berlin, is being provided by the exhibition designers of the Kooperative für Darstellungspolitik, the Cooperative for the Politics of Display. In many respects, they are to be considered co-authors of the exhibition parts of the project, like the designers of the graphic studio HIT, who provided the design of the publications and the many topographical layers in the exhibition space at HKW. They are highly distinctive solutions for the problems entailed by the necessity to present very heterogeneous exhibits ranging from archival material, books, learning tools, vintage architectural plans and scale models to newly commissioned video and sound works. Not only define the exhibition's look, atmosphere, experience, and didacticism, they also shape the research and production of the project itself. A key premise of the conceptualization and planning of the two exhibitions and of all the other events, formats, collaborations, etc. they entailed, was to use the budget primarily to instigate new research and new production. In Utrecht and Berlin, the public presentations were organized and are organized along case studies pursued by experts from different parts of the world geographically and from art and academic places institutionally. Besides the already mentioned artists and researchers, for the Berlin itinerary we commissioned research and visual works by the architectural scholar Dubravka Sekulic and the filmmaker Anna Huschmann, by the writer and filmmaker Evan Calder-Williams, by architectural scholars Elke Bayer and Ola Uduku, by the artists Sabine Bitter, Helmut Weber and Clemens von Wedemeyer, by the architectural office Bar Architekten, by the educator and historian Claudia Hummel, by the architectural historians Oliver Sucrow and Dina Dorothea Falbe, by the performative project Kein schöner Archiv, by the film curator Ludger Blanke, together with Arsenal Institute for Film and Video Art, by the Berlin social workers and educators from Street College, and more. In Berlin, my colleagues from the Communication and Education Department at HKW have been very committed to organizing essential components of the Education Shock project, namely a collaboration with 8 schools in Berlin whose facilities have been designed and built in the 1960s and 1970s, that generated projects by students and led to the drafting of a manifesto for the reform of learning environments. The manifesto and a 13-minute video on these projects are now available on the HKW website. Of course, as everywhere, the pandemic has impacted the project severely. Repeated reschedulings, stressed out co-workers, the slowing down and stretching out of everything, the financial drain, this alone had led to a state of constant alertness, combined with phases of utter numbness as well as frantic productivity. Apart from these significant changes of context and conditions, the very aim and subject of the project, the reconstruction of the discourses around educational facilities from a particular period and a particular angle of interest, is now to be seen in a highly different light. The debates about learning and education, about online teaching and homeschooling, about the social and economic inequities made palpable by the epidemic, about the shortcomings of digitalization and about the vital importance of in-person classes, hold and physical environments. These COVID-related debates and topics are tangible in the entire project, even if only indirectly addressed. The exhibition was very deliberately supposed to be and designed as an open space for the gathering of groups of friends, families, school classes, etc., a place to meet and converse, with the exhibits working almost as environmental features, intended to be available for inspection, for viewing and reading, but not necessarily and compulsory the prime focus of attention. When COVID hit, 6 months in advance of the original opening date, it was too late to change and adapt the architectural design, conceived that purposely invites this kind of communality and sociability. Now, with the tentative opening date being April 1, and with hygienic restrictions allowing only very few visitors at a time at the gallery, who have to bring their own headphones or lend them at the ticket counter, and are not supposed to touch anything, this invitation is deemed to be an unfulfilled promise, an architectural curatorial gesture towards a different past or future. Of course, the very title Education Shock will be read as an ad hoc response to the shock of the educational system caused by the pandemic. And we will have to go an extra mile to explain and clarify what can and what should not be expected from the actual exhibition. On the other hand, the exhibition can be considered as timely and topical, particularly concerning its archaeological historiographical bent. In the next 30 minutes or so, I would like to hint at some strands of research and thinking that went into the project's conceptualization. Even if only partially present in the exhibition itself, they can be retrieved by consulting the two Education Shock Publications, a larger anthology of original writings by the project's contributors, appended by selected source material in German, and a smaller volume of English essays by myself. The initial research question, developed together with my friend and comrade, the late Marion von Osten, around 2008, could be put like this. What kind of theories and programs of generative and rote learning, of empowering and disciplining pedagogies have informed the design and the use of classrooms, school buildings, campuses, as well as other more or less planned and purpose-built learning environments of the 1960s and 70s? How did educational and spatial politics interact and intersect, be it on the actual side of learning and teaching or on the scale of national and geopolitical educational planning? And what about the materialization of contested spatial concepts such as desegregation, integration, access, or participation? The symbolic starting point for the education shock age was the shock that struck the West on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1 entered into orbit. The initial shock was followed by a historical phase, the policy challenges around education and child rearing will mark this very epoch. The 1960s and 1970s were characterized by the rapid, often hasty, sometimes radical expansion of the institutions of learning, teaching, and research. For years, the subject was more present in the media than ever before or afterward. The leading cause of this multi-level institutional and cultural development was the need to manage and moderate the far-reaching transformations of the relations of production entailed by the impending transition from so-called industrial societies to the technological age, and ultimately to post-industrial societies. The skills and subjectivities required to master and survive these often shock-like shifts were expected to be provided by schools and universities, switching points of the state and social order. In a much-quoted text from 1970, the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser identified the school apparatus as the most inconspicuous but ultimately most dominant of the ideological state apparatuses of capitalist societies. According to Althusser, every individual, after being placed under the inevitable massive influence of the ideology of the ruling class and institutions of formal education, falls out of the schools and universities and into the place in society and production designated for them. Without explicitly addressing the architectural dimensions of the school apparatus, Althusser's seemingly scientific yet highly metaphoric language was guided by a notion of a pernicious spatiality of educational institutions through which children and adolescents pass, only to emerge from them as subjects more or less prepared and formatted to fit into the ever-evolving machinery of social production and reproduction. But does Althusser's spatial trope of the school apparatus provide any help to understand, for example, the complex spatialities of translocality, migration, and schooling, which came to the fore in Europe around the time of his writing? In the following, I want to very cursorily and fragmentarily single out two deeply interdependent problematics of education spatiality during the education shock decades. First, the limits of access to education as they became articulated in spatial discourse. And second, the trope of openness that was of such central importance at the time. In Western Europe around 1970, the geopolitics of the Cold War, the consequences of decolonization, and a globalizing economy have become increasingly tangible in waves of immigration. In France or the United Kingdom, a new multicultural society was emerging, and with it, the multiracial school. The conflict around immigration policies and the tensions emerging in multi-ethnic immigrant communities immediately affected the reality in schools and universities. It was not until far into the 1970s, however, that the education and planning implications of the realities of post-colonial immigrant societies were recognized by policymakers and educationalists. Beginning with the late 1950s, the economic situation in West Germany required the employment of so-called Gastarbeiter, guest workers, which not only caused the need for accommodation and housing, but also for additional teaching capacities, language courses, for example. Some of the sending countries ran their own schools with teachers instructing in their national languages. However, since children were subject to compulsory schooling under German law, the children of migrant workers also had to be integrated into preschools and schools, even though the authorities in 1970 still estimated that around 25% of immigrant school-age children weren't attending school. There are hardly any systematic studies on how this integration has taken place in individual schools or nationwide, how and whether required additional teaching was organized, whether and if so how planners and architects responded to the changing educational needs, that is preparatory classes, language teaching, the design and establishment of the migrant community's own schools, etc. Integration without equality stated the title of the leftist pedagogical journal Betrifft Erziehung in a 1973 themed issue on guest worker children. Teachers were required to limit themselves to classroom instruction, officially disallowed from supporting migrant children outside of regular school hours. Appropriate spatial conditions for successful schooling did not exist in the buildings. Neither the education system nor individual schools and their facilities were prepared to welcome and adequately attend to immigrant students. And the space available for children within their homes frequently did not suffice for children to learn successfully. Thus, the interrelatedness of the spatial predicaments of education and housing was and continues to be particularly tangible for students discriminated against in racialized societies. The issues of the equal and just provision of spaces for learning cannot be separated from societal conditions beyond the school, as much as theories of education have been emphasizing the relative autonomy of the realm of pedagogy. Originating in Johann Wolfgang Goethe's educational theory developed in Wilhelm Meister's journeyman years, and since having become an influential concept in the Bildung lexicon, the phrase pedagogical province declares the school to be an area of performativity shielded from other social spaces. But there exists a close connection between school and housing to be reckoned with. Neglecting this connection means failing to identify the reasons for the segregation that continues to this day. In the United States, for example, the disproportionate biased distribution of students in urban areas continues to be facilitated through zoning means such as educational gerrymandering and the unequal funding of schools depending on a specific neighborhood's income tax. Urban policies impinge on educational realities. The economic well-being of an urban area is reflected in the quality of its schools and the career outlooks of their alumni. On the other hand, any isolated treatment of education likely contributes to a spatial paradox of education policy, that is, reform efforts and investments in education may lead to individual social and geographical mobility, while little is changed with regard to the disenfranchisement of particular neighborhoods in relation to others. Such difficulties and limitations for migrant families led parents to self-organize in the 1970s, 60s and 70s and 80s, a little-known episode in the history of education and migration. Parallels and comparisons may be drawn, for example, to the Scuole e Quartiere movement in Italy, which from the mid-1960s onwards attempted to compensate for the deficits of the urban educational system and schools' capacity problems caused by internal migration from south to north through self-organized childcare and moving classes to shops and private kitchens. The Kinderläden, storefront kindergartens, and other forms of autonomous care and schooling that mushroomed in European cities around 1968 were fortunate to have references and models in the Italian initiatives, not least in terms of their origins in proto-feminist empowerment and reproductive labor theory. Further into the 1970s, Italian feminist groups such as Rivolta Femminile foregrounded the issue of gendered spaces. In Milan and other cities, they created autonomous spaces for autocoscienza, consciousness raising, or writing workshops outside the confines of the private home. Meeting in bookshops and rented rooms, the women produced non-domestic geographies of subjectivity and self-determined learning. In parallel, around 1970, a labor struggle emerged that successfully sought to guarantee 150 waged hours per year of public adult education, ratified in 1972. Initially driven by factory workers and farmers, the Centocinquanta Order movement encouraged feminist organizing of autonomous education and knowledge production in environments of informal learning throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. Thus, the spatialities and temporalities of education were reconfigured in local and sometimes translocal assemblages of labor politics, applied theories of lifelong learning, and feminist practices of empowerment and deconfinement. Women's leverage in issues of placemaking had long been silenced and invisibilized, but as the feminist architect group Matrix stated in the early 1980s, precisely because women are brought up differently in our society, we have different experiences and needs in relation to the built environment, which are rarely expressed. How these experiences and needs could be reflected in the design and planning of educational spaces and places emerged slowly as a point of contestation in the education shock years, starting with feminist redrawings of the private-public binarism and the creation of safe spaces of self-determined learning. But it was still to take a while until a more intersectional critique of the built environment in general and the environments of formal and informal learning in particular would be made. The disconnection of education, spatiality, and racism could probably be most acutely observed in the United States. The segregation of North American society was and is manifest in the urban geographical and architectural separation of white people and people of color. Segregation effectively structured and continues to structure the accessibility of schools and universities for people of color and thus function as a lever of educational justice. Any critical addressing of the intimate ties between educational and spatial politics is therefore doomed to failure if it doesn't take the issue of racialization and anti-blackness into consideration. For it affects the entire gamut of spatial, regional, urban planning, educational policy, architectural design, and pedagogical theory and practice. In the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, the Supreme Court voted that black student exclusion from white elementary schooling on the grounds that schools for blacks were separate but equal contradicted the very equality guaranteed by the Constitution. From this moment, the quest to abolish segregation, to desegregate, was no longer solely a priority of the civil rights movement and was taken up by the educational policies of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, all the while framed by a long and ever-intense media debate. The commitment to integration yielded infrastructural, urban, and architectural consequences. A blatant social spatial injustice had to be abolished, which also meant that the entire system of urban zoning and its effects on the distribution of educational opportunities had to be brought into the planning of new schools and the redesign of existing ones. Decades of political negotiation, fierce anti-racist struggle, and urban planning were to revolve around the question of how to arrive at actual desegregation. Among the various attempts to find a promising non-racist future of education was the proposal of large centralized school centers, education parks, designed and occasionally realized since the mid-1960s. Other examples of desegregated schooling models born in the ensuing years were inner-city neighborhood community schools. In addition, public magnet schools introduced in the late 1960s soon became a favorite medium of equity pursuing educational politics based on the ideal of the freedom of school choice. Providing a particular curriculum with theme-based programs around science, math, and performing arts, magnet schools aimed to stop white flight and attract ethnically diverse student bodies. Students were drawn both from beyond the assigned schooling district and from the school's immediate neighborhood. This was supported by voluntary though not particularly successful, desegregation plans on the city level that opposed mandatory school busing. School busing became one of the most controversial issues within education politics. Just like the magnet schools, which organized students into a desired demographic composition, busing proved to be a tool of planning to produce a certain student population by geospatial means. Advocated for by proponents of the civil rights movement and a range of progressive educators, disenfranchised black and white students were transported to desegregated schools, often located long distances from their homes. Envisioned to be a way to end racial divide and achieve desegregation, busing was, however, met with massive resistance in many parts of the country. During the 1970s, it became a subject of increasingly bitter contestation, yet another palpable articulation of how deeply divided and racialized US society still was, despite all the struggles fought and progress made in the 1950s and 60s. In an influential 1972 article, the neoconservative sociologist Nathan Glaser, an opponent of busing, maintained that white children were in effect being conscripted to create an environment which, it had been decided, was required to provide equality of education opportunity for black children. In a typical inversion of the arguments of the purveyors of desegregation, Glaser accused the busing movement of enlisting students, white and black, to provide a racial environment, as he called it. On the other side of the debate, concerns were raised around the long, time-consuming transport of buses. Usually, black students traveled from inner cities to newly built suburbs predominantly inhabited by whites. These dislocations were considered to be ultimately detrimental to the educational experience and learning success. Supported by racist jurisprudence, rubber-stamped arbitrariness, and educational obstinacy, discrimination was thus spatially manifest and politically established all too permanently. And this situation certainly did not only pertain to the United States, but was to be found in numerous places worldwide, amid an atmosphere that was otherwise marked by liberal reformism and radical anti-authoritarianism. Frustration over failed or inconsequential desegregation and the radicalization of the black struggle in the United States, in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, entailed the creation of new counterspaces of learning. From the mid-1960s onward, storefront schools and street academies opened in numerous cities. Social workers repurposed vacant shops, creating alternative spaces for social work and schooling for high school fallouts and disadvantaged youth. In the United Kingdom, the grassroots black supplementary school movement was created by the African and Caribbean community in the mid-1960s. Concerned parents, teachers, church groups, community organizations, and members of the public set up educational provision on the weekends or evenings in order to provide black young people with basic school curricula and black history, Kehinde Andrews noted, adding that the elusive archive of this movement has to be reconstructed from the experiences and memories of those who organized and passed through it. In Harlem, New York, the Urban League Street Academy program helped prepare students for college who had walked out of the public school system, which yielded the founding of the legendary Harlem Preparatory School in 1967. In Oakland, the Black Panther Party ran the Oakland Community School, OCS. The elementary school, founded in 1971, developed out of a combined daycare and homeschool known as the Children's House and the Intercommunal Youth Institute. After moving to a modernist former church building, OCS was in operation from 1973 until 1982, deploying elements of Freire's radical pedagogy and earning acclaim from the California Department of Education and the Governor of California. In major cities throughout the United States, alternative black schools complemented and radicalized the existing system of segregated black schools and colleges. With the reinvigoration of black studies and the increasing militancy of the black struggle in the 1960s, radical methodologies of education and tactical modes of knowledge production emerged that effectively politicized the space of the campus and arguably the space of learning more generally. In 1967, search for education, elevation, and knowledge SEEK, an experimental collaborative affirmative action program, was founded at the City College of New York. It targeted students mainly from the Black and Puerto Rican communities who were marginalized and otherwise excluded from educational institutions. Among the group of poets and writers to soon join the faculty were Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Raymond Patterson, Ijaz Ahmad, Adrienne Rich, and Toni Cade Bambara. Carving out an environment of de-hierarchized, open-ended, student-centered informal learning within the space of the college campus proved generative of specific ways to thinking the spatial politics of alternative Black studies. Bambara, who taught and wrote Realizing the Dream of the Black University, the title of an essay from 1969, challenged students to carefully investigate all the spaces they occupy from the classroom to their homes, endowing her students with the courage and camaraderie to explore their own upbringings, ideologies, and prejudices instead of ignoring, dismissing, suppressing, or transmitting them. Resonating with such edu-spatial poetics and politics was Adrienne Rich's notion, found in teaching notes from 1970, of the polyvalence of the classroom to be lived as confinement or communality. Classroom as cell, unit, enclosed and enclosing space in which teacher and students are alone together can be prison cell, commune, trap, junction place of coming together, torture chamber. Carefully attending to the malleability of classroom typology was an important dimension of the kind of Black feminist pedagogy practiced by Bambara, Rich, and others active in alternative educational endeavors such as SEEK or the Urban League Street Academy program. Their invitation to think in spatial and pedagogical terms emphasized the performativity and the psychology of spaces, be they physical or epistemological. For these programs, dreaming the dream of the Black universities meant producing and maintaining spaces of Blackness within an otherwise anti-Black environment. Contesting racial segregation could thus result in the poetic subversion and imaginative revolution of educational norms. The storefront approach to learning and facilitating may have been short-lived and ephemeral, but its legacy is a lasting one. It deviated from the empty promise of desegregation where, in the classroom, in the cafeteria, and in most social spaces, as Bell Hooks pointed out, racial apartheid prevailed. Integration was the central discursive strategy to overcoming segregation within education. A political term, integration was also a spatial metaphor invoking images of connection, interweaving, and embeddedness. Arguably, this gesturing toward spatiality informed the ways in which integration gained normative force in the course of educational policies in the 1960s and 70s. And indeed, the concept of integration advanced to foster the principle of equality and the goal of overcoming social barriers, increasingly impacted the organization and the experience of schools and universities. In relation to the built environment, the term often assumed the meaning of a fact or state of things rather than a process to be materialized in policy and architecture. Accordingly, the education parks in community and magnet schools mentioned before represented the policies of desegregation as much by way of their curricula as via architectural forms and geographical location. And next to combating racial divisions, integration was used to remedy other forms of discrimination and inequality, such as those related to ableism. Integrating students with disabilities meant to liberate them from the purview of special education and its apparatus of auxiliary schools and bring them into so-called normal education. The project of integration, inclusion, has always been inseparable from the issue of physical barriers. Architectural design and the layout of buildings has continually kept students with disabilities from attending public school. In response to this neglect in the UK, a disability advocate such as the architect Selwyn Goldsmith, himself paralyzed after contracting polio, has offered new frameworks for barrier-free planning since the early 1960s. The fact that architectural firms such as Foster Associates occasionally produce designs for so-called special schools, see for example their 1975 Palmerston Special School in Liverpool, may attest to a growing awareness of the issue of inclusion among the profession in the 1970s. After the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, which required that newly constructed public buildings in the United States to meet basic standards of accessibility, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, which has been known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education since 1970, and features the principle of the least restrictive environment. It took almost another 20 years, from 75 onwards, until an international agreement of a similar nature was reached with the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs Education in 1994. Regarding disability, the term integration has gradually been replaced by that of inclusion. Invoking a topology of inside and outside, inclusion seems to address the spatial dimension of equity even more effectively. Early on, the concept of inclusive schooling was linked to the unstreamed, non-hierarchical comprehensive school, the Gesamtschule or enseignement secondaire. In his foreword to a volume on buildings for so-called handicapped children from 1974, the architect and school building expert Manfred Schulz argued that allocating children who do not meet the requirements of normal schools due to mental or physical disadvantages to special schools only affirmed an anachronistic position. According to the, quote, last apologists of the tripartite school system, quote, end of quote, a diverse student body could most efficiently be managed by a hierarchical layering of school types, Hauptschule, Realschule, and Gymnasium in the West German context. Any categorizing of students, Scholz contended, relies on traditional norms that provide no support for the individual. Instead, they allow for a problematic sorting out of those students who do not fit the norm. Progressive educationalists sought to relate comprehensive school and education centers to the project of inclusion, which seemed to be a logical move due to their respective architecture and curriculum. Comprehensive schools were key to policies of educational equity and efficaciousness promoted by social democrats. This school type, allegedly embodying the effort to transcend class difference, was the contested symbol of educational reforms in many Western European countries, especially in the United Kingdom and in West Germany. Featuring open plan designs, multifunctional classrooms with movable walls, and state-of-the-art technological equipment, they were supposed to represent flexibility, mobility, and student-centered planning, while projecting a sense of self-sufficiency, comprehensive all day. However, the noble project of educational democratization regularly clashed with the prosaic demands of economic calculation and educational effectiveness. Moreover, the architectural language of massive school complexes wasn't universally appreciated. It was read by many as a provocation, sparking protests by parents, politicians, teachers, and students. Identified with left-wing social democratic educational policy, the comprehensive school, both in terms of its principled integration and structural design, was the target of choice of conservatives who were against the dismantlement of the tiered school system. The promotion of inclusion as a major project of disability politics suffered from the conflicted nature of the comprehensive school. However, in West Germany, bipartisan political consensus regarding the integration of young people with disabilities into the school system was almost reached around the time Manfred Scholz published his book. Thus, that he featured architectural designs for special schools may have already been considered anachronistic for some. The combination of integration and flexibility has been a constant feature of educational planning discourse since the early 1960s. The open plan was regarded as the perfect matrix for an architecture that would respond to the pressing organizational, pedagogical, and economic requirements and demands of the time. The schools without walls derived from the dominant post-war spatial idiom of the open plan office or Bürolandschaft, office-scape. With it came the promise of adapting to changing learning situations at any time while allowing for a student-centered approach and encouraging individual initiative and independent study. The open plan was advocated for strongly by the Educational Facilities Laboratories, EFL. The New York-based Research and Consulting Institute was founded in 1958 by the Ford Foundation in cooperation with the American Institute of Architects and Teachers College of Columbia University, and it operated until the 1980s. The EFL disseminated advice on open plan and prefab building systems, such as the school construction systems development, primarily addressed to educational administrations in the United States, but also intended to inform school construction elsewhere. In addition to being a design paradigm, the open plan embodied, at least from a Western perspective, an entire ideological program fostering progressive views on work, organization, pedagogy, and architecture, one not necessarily shared in a global context. Carlo Testa, an independent consultant for educational architecture, pointed out in the mid-1970s, for example, that Soviet schools were planned according to a different set of typological standards than an EFL-type open plan, providing an alternative, unusual mixture of discipline, guidelines, and progressive teaching content, suggesting a, quote, critical reanalysis of some fashionable Western theories like flexibility, permissiveness, etc., end of quote. In a famous turn of phrase, the psychologist and educator Loris Malaguzzi called the spatial environment of learning the third teacher, terzo insegnante, alongside children of the same age and adults, that is. Malaguzzi, who in the 1940s founded a new type of relational early education in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy, inspiring a nationwide network of childcare centers and kindergartens, conceived of pedagogy as a collective production of space. In Malaguzzi's view, participants in the educational process were entitled to contribute to the planning and design of its spaces, thus challenging the traditional hierarchies within the design of the spatial relations of learning. Inspired by Malaguzzi and other progressive educators, architects, and urban theorists in the 1960s and 1970s, increasingly refocused attention on the needs and ideas of children. In 1967, Mechthild Schump, a young sociologist interested in the history of the urban utopias, conducted intense interview-based research on the way children perceived the architecture of the newly opened Mittelpunktschule Baunatal near the West German city of Kassel. Through a contemplative analysis of scale models of schoolyards and classrooms, children were encouraged to talk about spatial behavior, participation, and everyday school life. The preoccupation with the immediate environment of learning and the possibilities of its transformation soon became a central component of new forms of teaching, especially in the context of the so-called aesthetic education. George Denison, an elementary school teacher influenced by progressive educators such as John Dewey, A.S. Neal, and Leo Tolstoy, worked at the First Street School in New York with children and youth who were believed to be difficult to teach but were in fact underprivileged. In his much-read book, The Lives of Children from 1969, Denison emphasized the character of the school as an environment to be experienced. In opposition to the conditions of a capitalist society, the space of the school was to be controlled in the interest of children, that is, without any coercion. Similar to Malaguzzi and Schump, Denison pleaded for the principle of relationality, pointing beyond material and institutional predicaments. Quote, "We might cease thinking of school as a place and learn to believe that it is basically relationships between children and adults, adults and adults, children and other children. The four walls and the principal's office would cease to loom so hugely as the essential ingredients." End of quote. In the course of the 1960s and early 1970s, pedagogical practice and its terminology changed in many places, often stepping away from and contesting restorative tendencies. Programmatically, notions of classroom and schoolhouse were supplemented or even replaced by terms such as learning environment and learning place, thus invoking ideas rooted in behavioral theory, in behavioral studies and ecology. Meanwhile, playgrounds and preschool facilities were increasingly unconfined, pulled out of isolation and placed in the urban environment. Toward the end of the 1960s, openness had become a central trope of education, not only in the architectural programming of classrooms, as seen above, but also in the sense of a more widely conceived open space or open education. In 1969, the educator Herbert R. Cole published his small book, The Open Classroom, which quickly evolved into a manifesto of the radical anti-authoritarian pedagogical movement. In a footnote, Günter Weidle, the German translator of Cole's book, provided a short introduction to the phrase open classroom for the German reader. I quote, "Open classroom refers specifically to the classroom as a space that is not pre-structured but is left open for a teaching process that develops spontaneously from the needs and interests of the students and sometimes to this teaching process itself, which the teacher keeps open in every respect, temporally. Openness referred to an organically developing, not programmed division of time into unforeseen shifts in time. Spatially, openness referred to the environment, which is either a crucial part of the teaching or into which the students evade to learn on the spot. Spiritually, openness referred to the spontaneity of the students into unplanned initiatives and changes of direction that result from it." End of quote. This compact commentary on the meaning of open classroom was supplemented by reference to the semantics of open in the Anglo-American debate, such as Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies from 1944. It can also be related to the University Without Walls, an open study program with evening classes and independent studies that was launched in the early 1970s in 17 US colleges. The appeal of the semantics of openings was also evident in the name of the Open University in the United Kingdom, founded in 1969. It was another university without walls and perhaps even more consistently so in many ways. For although the Open University had a physical campus in Milton Keynes, it primarily offered a program of distance learning based on seminars and lectures that were broadcast on BBC television. The various modes or dimensions of openness that Weidle listed and which are evidenced above all in a pedagogical expectation of the unexpected were not to be confused with the opening up of schools and universities to technologically enhanced forms of education and to the possibility of part-time and distance learning. However, they all share an interest in breaking down boundaries, overcoming outdated hierarchies, and empowering those who, as children, have no voice and no right to self-determined learning, or those who, as residents of a socially disadvantaged area, are given the chance of equal treatment in the radical open classroom, or those who, living far away from a university, can attain a university degree only via distance learning. These openings were reactions to what educational researcher Charles E. Silberman has called the crisis in the classroom, or the failure of the public school. Silberman, in his book of the same title from 1970, traveled through the misery of the US school system and, in contrast, the glorious tradition of the progressive, reformist pedagogy of John Dewey et al., while also citing current examples of progressive initiatives. Between 1967 and 1972, for example, the Parkway program in Philadelphia, sponsored by the Ford Foundation and by the city's school administration, pursued the experiment of a school without walls by providing high school level instruction distributed throughout the city. The curriculum included tutorials, internships, self-managed learning, a high degree of autonomy, and a focus on the active interests of the students. As to be expected, this openness also turned out to be a problem, as it often resulted in student absences, exhaustion, and disorientation. But dissolving the brick and mortar school building as the centralized, compulsory site of pedagogical experience was observed with astonishment and admiration by an audience of international experts, to be adopted and continued in many other cities as a model for urban education. The very optimism surrounding projects such as the Parkway program in Philadelphia and the very notion of the open classroom or the open schoolroom was criticized and by writers and critics such as Jonathan Kozol, who, rather than sharing the kind of euphoria and the forward-looking enthusiasm of the proponents of the schools without walls, was looking behind the scenes, so to speak, and in very harsh words relativized and attacked the very rhetorics of and the very kind of conceptual groundings of this movement towards openness in educational policies. I quote from a text he published in 1972. In most cases, what we do in public schools in the United States today is not to suppress, but to buy out the revolutionary instincts of our children. We offer them independent research, individualized learning, open structured education, non-directive class discussions. Each child, in the standard code word of the fashion, learns at his own pace. Teachers are present not as educators, but as resource people. The children do their own thing. Everybody tells it like it is and tells other people where it's at. It's all fashionable, fun, and innovative. It is intelligently marketed and publicized. It is remarkably well packaged. It is my belief, however, that these changes do not seriously undermine the overriding purposes and operations of a public school, but have at best the function of adorning servitude with momentary flashes of delight and secondary avenues of unimportant deviation. At no point do these kinds of changes touch upon the basic anaesthetic character of public school, its anti-ethical function, its chauvinistic fealties, its inculcation of the sense of vested interest and credentialized reward, its clever perpetration of a sense of hate and options in a closed and tightly circumscribed arena. At no point is there honest confrontation with the mandate of a man's or of a woman's sense of justice. At no point is there actual, concrete, vivid provocation of that sense of justice. This sentence is the one for me which sums up all the rest. Children are not free in any way that matters if they are not free to know the price and pain and exploitation that their lives are built upon. Stated differently, just children cannot be educated in an unjust school. A school which constitutes an island of self-authorized and of self-serving privilege within a land of pain is not a just school, whatever the games the school board authorizes, whatever the innovative slogans it may ply. End of quote. And I would like to end here to start the conversation with Axel. Thank you very much.
Tom, thanks so much for this super inspiring and material-rich talk that guided us through a long and complicated discussion around education and educational policies as expressed in architectural or spatial and related discourses, or the discourses that lie behind architectural discussions. We invited you in the context of a show by Jef Geys, who has worked for 30 years as a teacher in a middle school in Balen, and who the school in a way appears in many of his works. And on the one hand, the school is for him one space in which he interacts with different people with a different social context than he would usually deal with in art or exhibition context. So there was one kind of expressed desire of him by continuing to working with schools, and he did that besides working in other contexts as well, such as pubs. But there is, of course, also a kind of a deeper interest in questions of education in equality or inequality, as you also mentioned as a question in educational policies in general, and a kind of very deep interest in questions of learning in a less authoritarian way. And what I kind of observed when working on the show and talking about the exhibition is that there is this kind of like maybe shared interest or notion, or almost a kind of it's unquestioned that this is a kind of good or important goal. At the same time, that was kind of super interesting to in your talk. This is not such an easy or uncontested question, like what makes education more equal or less authoritarian, and to complicate this kind of other in that appears in the work of Jef Geys, like the school children, educational policies, education as a practice. And I guess like one interesting point to that is that we look, of course, to these questions or discourses from today's perspective, and what we experience today maybe as a kind of critique of the school system that exists. And I wanted to ask you, like for your project and the exhibition, or actually, your research on a broader scale that was expressed in two exhibitions by now. What's for you the contemporary anchor point or perspective for that research? How do you think? What's the question to which the exhibition is an answer?
Well, first of all, thank you, Axel, and thank you, Bergen Kunsthal, for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this kind of indeed long-term project of mine. And since it is such a long-term project and a question which is, or questions, a set of questions which I'm carrying around for quite a while, it is not that easy an answer which I might have at hand. There's to your question, there's certainly, I mean, since I'm coming from art, from the visual arts, and from that's my main kind of field of interest, and in a way my disciplinary home turf. I've been, of course, I mean, like so many others, observing an interest and growing interest in educational and pedagogical matters throughout the past, decades, for quite a while. And I've started since I've been always interested very much in these kind of post-war decades with regard to the contemporary arts of that time. I became more and more interested in the relationships between art making, art production, knowledge production, pedagogy, research, science, etc., and how artists, in particular visual artists, performing artists, were kind of claiming certain notions from those other fields, like the notion of research, for example, or the notion of being a kind of pedagogy, or being a pedagogue, or being a teacher, maybe, or a learner, and as an artist. And this often, I mean, this kind of notorious question that became notorious under the rubrum of the educational turn in the past 20 years was something that I was interested in terms of its genealogy, and how it reaches back into earlier kind of times of the 20th century, and how the kind of current interest in education, in matters of pedagogy, is didn't come out of the blue in a way. So there's this strong interest in matters of learning, matters of teaching, matters of research in various kind of avant-gardist and neo-avant-garde factions of the 20th century, and I became interested, for example, in the Fluxus movement in this regard, or in conceptual art, or even in someone like Beuys as kind of performing very much as a teacher, and I've been trying then to, I mean, which is what I mentioned in the talk during a project I did together with Marion van Osten in Vienna at the Academy in the late 2000s on what we call the education image, or das Erziehungsbild. We've been trying to bring together those, I mean, the various layers that are usually that usually stay separate of visual production, visual arts, and the realm of pedagogy and teaching, without being particularly interested, or also being interested, but not mainly interested in the educational turn in the arts, but more in the ways in which artistic or aesthetic methodologies have been present in the practice of teaching, in the practice of learning, or in the practices of learning for quite a while, without being recognized as such or appreciated as such. And while we've been kind of preparing a lecture series and a book on the education image, there more and more material gathered in my various files on the particular relationship between space and learning and pedagogy. And although we haven't really used it in this project I did with Marion, since then I've always been interested in turning this kind of material into a project of sorts. And while focusing on this particular period of the 1960s and 70s, this period has been of particular interest to me since it is a time when progressives from all sides, from the official establishment, government sides, and from the more countercultural or oppositional parts of society, have been in a way teamed up at many occasions for the sake of, or in the interest of, the reform, of the improvement of the conditions of learning and teaching. And this became necessary, and that is in a way also the shock in the education shock in the course or in the aftermath of the Soviets' successful launching of the Sputnik 1 in November of 1957, after this event, the so-called technological gap became apparent to the West, to the Americans in particular, and in order to close this technological gap, an unprecedented initiative was taken to expand and to the educational and the scientific sector, and in order to not fall behind in the kind of Cold War space race and the more general race, which is about kind of dominance in the world in a way, and this kind of geopolitical kind of competition on the field of education was, in a way, was concurrent with a structural shift on the social and economic level, a shift which is being called, or which has been dubbed, the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial society, and the need of and the kind of requirement to have more people qualified in technological, scientific matters, and the need to broaden in a way the base of employment for in the interest of the advance of this kind of post-industrial knowledge society. And so there's different things came together in this time after kind of the late 50s, which were in favor of innovation, of reform, of expansion of the educational sector, and many very kind of otherwise very different and oppositional or opposing constituencies and actors suddenly kind of met on the same ground for a short while between the early 60s and the early 70s.
Yeah, actually, it's nice that you mention the educational image, the book, which I actually contributed the text to that with together with Jesko Fezer, and I kind of didn't think about this before this talk today, but of course that's really a kind of the book was published. When did you say? 2000 years, so it's really a while ago, but yeah, it shows the kind of like the ongoingness or the kind of the long-termness of your research, but also the kind of ongoingness of the question or the notoriety of this topic of education, I guess, because you mentioned the kind of the shift from post-Fordist to a kind of neoliberal system, which also has to do, of course, with this claim or call to self-initiative and lifelong learning, etc., and the kind of broader importance that education and self-education gained since then, or has in a kind of contemporary, I guess, system of career building and planning. And but maybe since you also mentioned art in your background, I was wondering, in the exhibition, you mentioned in the beginning a couple of artists that have contributed to the exhibition at HKW and also in Utrecht. But what was the kind of role of artists for the show?
Well, the show is, or the entire project is very much structured around those, contributions both by artists, by visual practitioners, and by scholars and researchers. And they sometimes teamed up. They've been working on case studies which they developed in very different ways, of course, depending on their kind of personal, individual approach and methodology. And of course, the people I asked were known to me, not least due to their kind of ongoing interest in these matters, in these issues of educational histories, of the particular kind of resistances maybe that can be retrieved in those histories, the kind of the energies of the political energies and the aesthetic energies kind of in a way folded into those histories. And there was and it was, since I had this kind of great opportunity to do this kind of smaller project at BAC at Utrecht, at a place which is known for its kind of dissenting ways of interpreting its role as an institute or as an institution of contemporary art. The people I've been working there with and the people I brought to Utrecht were in a way, already, I mean, interested in these kinds of kind of breachings of the gap between kind of art proper and research and different, I mean, the kind of historical interests and the kind of epistemological interests I kind of proposed or I had were in a way very much in sync with what kind of what most of what all of them had anyways on their mind, and therefore it was great to have, I mean, the opportunity to work on these two projects, starting with the smaller one where many of the artists who now develop their projects into much larger ones for the second itinerary at HKW had the occasion to test out kind of earlier versions, rather sketchy versions at times of long-term projects of theirs. And for example, Filipa Cesar and Sonia Vaz-Borges, who've been working on the anti-colonial struggle in Guinea-Bissau in the late 60s and early 1970s, and in particular the role schools and the educational theories of Amical Cabral played in these struggles. They proposed a very modest piece for the Utrecht part of the project, and now made a kind of a splendid film which they shot in last year in Guinea-Bissau in the mangrove forests on a sub-history of this history, the history of guerrilla fighters building makeshift schools into the mangrove trees. And so this is and this film is and the entire project that it is embedded in is of a different scope and scale than it was originally, for example. And so there's also the possibility, which I find, what I found so kind of fantastic about the project so far, is to kind of develop individual research projects towards to become more than they had been intended to originally, and this is what I consider the collaborative and the research kind of aspect or dimension of the entire project. It's really not. I've been bringing a lot to the table, a lot of material, a lot of my own research, but at the end of the day, it's largely the project of those who contributed to it, and not kind of curators, kind of offspring.
Yeah, I mean, I am looking forward to hopefully be able to see the exhibition in Berlin. I haven't seen it in Utrecht, sadly, but saw some images. And I mean, you mentioned generously the collaborators also on the design level. So it's really important. I agree that it's an exhibition is always it's very collaborative format, almost like a theater piece with a lot of people participating in the making of a show. But just knowing exhibitions that you have made in the past, I kind of expect also a lot of your material, the physical material of research, books, notes, and so on, being in the show, I would assume.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it is to large. I mean, large parts of it are kind of collections of archival material of books, for example. I try to use the books as parts of larger tableaus of like images, the covers of books, etc. Sometimes you are invited to read into a page or read into the book itself, but mostly I'm not trying to to turn visitors, viewers into readers in the exhibition. It's more you can really look at those books, and it's and watch them as something, like a piece of visual art. But it's but there is the way in which the Kooperative for Darstellungspolitik and I and all the other contributors have been working together was again extremely generative. I mean, it was already the case in Utrecht, where we had a very small budget. We were working on a shoestring budget, but they proposed a way to organize the material which was kind of highly effective and original. And the same is now due for the HKW itinerary. For HKW, it is a well budgeted but not over budgeted project, and I try to use as much of the budget for the contributors and for commissioning new work and to pay research work being done. There are very few loans. There's not a lot of kind of insurance costs in the budget. It's really about making possible this research and this actual visual production, and to provide, to display, to show material which is largely coming from my own archive. And it's and so I kind of try to spend as much money on these kind of features, aspects of the exhibition, but also on the architecture and the design of the exhibition itself. And what started out to be a rather kind of modest a modest endeavor in terms of the architecture and the design, had ended up with I think some of the more spectacular exhibitions the Kooperative did so far, and it was a similarly surprising kind of process, or a process full of surprises, as the one we had in Utrecht, but also another exhibition I did with them, the Neolithic Childhood, in 2008, which I co-created with Ansel Franke, also at HKW, and they again, I mean, made kind of turned the exhibition hall at HKW into a very entertaining and I think also popular, not almost populist place, which I was anyway in favor of from the very start, to not produce an exhibition which is too scholarly in its approach and too nerdy in the way it goes about those kind of archival findings, but it's really fun, and so this is more like it. We kind of try to bring into the space elements of kind of 60s and 70s architecture, and also school architecture, educational architecture, and the architecture of trade fairs, and so each of the 38 case studies or 38 contributions is kind of is equipped with the title written in big letters into the space, hanging from the ceilings, and with the cover or with the banner for each of these case studies, so that the moment you enter the exhibition hall, you already have an idea of what you might expect, because you can even read the most distant kind of signs and know what kind of theme, what subject, what question is being asked at this point in the space. And so this is also for them, I think, quite a step beyond or besides of what they've been doing so far.
Yeah, I was keen to touch on the exhibition itself, also because, I mean, of course, you could say the exhibition space is also a kind of a school of sorts, and it's basically a didactic medium. It's connected. It has a history in learning. It also has a history in trade fairs, actually. But this kind of element of learning, of education, is especially strong today, when a lot of institutions, public institutions, their reason of existence and their self-ambition sometimes more forcefully pushed on them, sometimes also embraced. I do agree that art institutions have a kind of educational role to fill. What kind of education is another question, but I think there is also this subtext for me in thinking about an exhibition on these kind of spatial configurations for learning as a discourse. And then there's also, of course, thinking about art again. This is especially true for artists who take on this role of working in a kind of educational, pedagogical manner. And you mentioned in the beginning that there's also this aspect of the exhibition of live projects by artists in schools in Berlin, where this kind of like this role for art of becoming or fulfilling a role of social engagement via pedagogies is kind of reflected or tested. And that's, of course, really it's a crucial role, a crucial question for art today. Like it's again, like it's something that's in some way pushed on the art context. It's a kind of, you could say there's a discourse of functionalization, but on the other hand, it's also, I do think, an important aspect to reflect, like in how far art always had this kind of role of, information as well.
Well, in the tradition of aesthetic thinking or art theory, this, of course, would be rejected as a because art is supposed to be a non-selling kind of agency, but autonomous in most of its in most of its kind of materializations, etc. But of course, I mean, there is a long tradition, of course, of the pedagogical in art and the useful in art, and the useful in terms in ways that are always kind of pedagogical, even didactic, and this. But I think the moment is not to be, or the moment we are living in is to be confused with kind of times when art was so an age of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. But I think, today, the way in which the system is developed, the way in which dependencies on institutional educations are becoming bigger and bigger for people who consider themselves, describe themselves as artists. There's almost no, there's almost no way to survive as an artist within the current system without also becoming a lecturer, a teacher in one way or other, someone employed at an art school, or being somehow affiliated to another kind of educational institution. And the artists also work as teachers in elementary schools or secondary schools. Mm-hmm. And therefore the way for example, the artists and the who have been working in this project with the 8 schools in the context of education shock, they all have a track record of these kinds of projects, working with students and pupils, using the school as, in a way, as a studio for them, and also the students and the institutes as collaborators for their practice, and this can be I'm really, I'd be very careful in making any kind of any judgments about this, because it is in a way it had become a specialization within the arts and within the creative industry or the creative sector as such, to do these kinds of kind of workshops and schools. But I think it's one of kind of best things you can that are being made currently with tools or with the methods of art. And so there's these projects which the Department for Special Education, HKW, instigated, were very affected by and we are lucky it could have been done in this kind of gap between two waves last year, so that there are actual results and actual kind of outcomes, or that these days happen in these schools, but what's lacking is what we hoped for is that the people visiting the exhibition can also taken on a tour to the school, and to the opportunity, the students having the opportunity to present their work to kind of external visitors to the school, which is not going to happen as far as I can see. Yeah. And this had been kind of a major kind of aspect of this project. And finally on another Haus der guten Welt, built, has been designed by an architect in 1957, the year the Sputnik shock happened, who was called Stubbins, and who had an architectural firm in Boston, which was specialized in educational buildings. So this architect mainly worked for East Coast colleges, but also and city governments planning schools in the US, but he was also working abroad in different countries, also in the Middle East, and the Congress Hall, which he designed, of course, from the start, it was conceived as a space of education and a space of education, entertainment and exhibitions, art, etc., but also largely as a space of education. In a way, the Haus der Kultur und der Welt institution, which is housed in this particular building, has been taking up this, in a way, this brief obligation, and very much kind of considers itself an educational place, an educational institution, with developing kind of pedagogical and educational formats in competition to existing institutions of education, and being very invested into the notion of advancing education and advancing methodologies of teaching and learning in almost every kind of project they are doing.
That's a good closing word, maybe. And we ran a bit out of time, but it's a good closing word because it's also pointing towards institutional agencies, and I think a lot of what you said just now is in a way also true for the Kunsthal, for the ambition, but also practice. Also actually working a lot with schools, for example. But thanks so much for the conversation, for the talk. And hope to see you again soon. And until when is the exhibition hopefully running?
The exhibition will open hopefully on 1 and will run into July 11th.
Okay. Let's hope for a good summer.
Yeah.
And see you then.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.